Hello readers, I'm the Avid reader and today we're reviewing Leadership 6 Studies in World Strategy by Henry Kissinger. So this is Henry Kissinger's last book, which came out in 2022, about a year before he died or so. So he wrote this book amazingly at age 99. It's a good book. It's better than his book World Order. It's about 6 world leaders during the Cold War and their different strategies in international relations mainly. And the interesting thing is that since Kissinger was an academic and a national security advisor and a secretary of state, he knew all of these 6 people personally to a certain extent. So there are individual chapters on Konrad Adenauer, on Charles de Gaulle, on Richard Nixon, on Anwar Sadat, on Kuan Yew, and on Margaret Thatcher. And there are also some reflections in the beginning and the end of the book. And one thing I like about this book is that Kissinger emphasizes that to a certain extent people can change things. They have free will to change things. They are limited by some circumstances, but the skill of a leader is to push those bounds as much as possible. And I read this book in a very weird way. So I did not read it chronologically at all. So there are 6 chapters. So I read the introduction, then I read chapter 5, then I read chapter 4, then I read chapter 3, then I read chapter 1, then I read chapter 2, and then I read chapter 6, and finally I read the conclusion. And I did use one of these chapters a lot for an essay I wrote for university, so it was actually a pretty useful book as a secondary source, or as a primary source kind of also. So the first chapter is about Konrad Adenauer, so the Chancellor of West Germany from 1949 to 1963. And Kissinger has an overarching theme for each chapter. So in this one, you have the strategy of humility. So Adenauer accepted that Germany had lost World War II, unlike the Social Democrats in Germany at the time. He understood that to regain German sovereignty, he needed to reconcile with Europe and with France, and he also needed to apologize to the Jews. So he regained German sovereignty in part through reconciling with France and making trade agreements, which eventually did turn into the EU. To apologize to the Jews, he did apologize to them directly, but he also visited Israel, and he also paid war reparations to Jews and to Israel as a sign of a sincere apology from him. And while Adenauer wanted a peaceful economic unification of Europe, he also wanted a strong American presence in Europe, and he worried about the plausibility of the American nuclear deterrent in case of the Soviets screwing around, as the Soviets screwed several times around with the special status of Berlin. And Adenauer also wanted the reunification of Germany, but he wanted so in the long run. So there was a time Stalin offered East and West Germany to unify, but Adenauer understood, okay, you do that, then you cut yourself off from the West. You have to be a neutral power, and then you might have a repeat of the German problems in both world wars. So it's better to have West Germany being built up and then eventually reunify with the East. Kissinger also talks about the succeeding chancellors, and he mentions that the actual Ostpolitik was that West Germany was improving relations with the Soviet Union and the Soviet satellites, but they still favored a strong American presence in Europe. Then Kissinger talks about Charles de Gaulle, and he has the strategy of will. So de Gaulle really willed things into existence. Things that were fictions became reality through de Gaulle. So when France surrendered in 1940 to Germany during World War II, he just, as a brigadier general, went to Britain and declared French resistance, the Free French Forces, and he declared himself as the leader, even though on paper he didn't have any legitimacy. He was strongly dependent on the Americans and especially the British, but he still pretended that France was an equal partner in a sense. And after you had the Normandy storming and France was liberated in 1944, he pretended that it was the Free French who had liberated France. De Gaulle was the de facto leader of the French provisional government from 1944 until he resigned in 1946 because he did not agree with the new French Fourth Republic that was being established, which was a parliamentary system. He wanted a republic with a stronger presidency. He believed that the weakness of French institutions had led to the downfall of the Third Republic. But he came back to power in 1958 because you had a crisis in Algeria. There was a war in Algeria that France could not win, and there was the worry about the presence of over 1 million French citizens in Algeria, and there was worries about a potential coup or civil war. And the only person who could solve this crisis, many people thought, or who could win the Algerian war, was de Gaulle. So he came back in 1958, was given basically dictatorial powers for 6 months to rewrite a French constitution. And here you can actually appreciate that even though de Gaulle was in a sense a dictator for a few months, he actually did recreate France to just be another type of democracy. He created a semi-presidential system that came into force in 1959, and he got himself elected as president, but he did not act like a typical dictator in any way, even though he could have. To the dismay of the people who had led to his return to power, he did actually surrender Algeria and allow their independence because he realized that the war could not be won. When you had the decolonization movement in Africa, he did grant French colonies in Africa for the most part independence very quickly, but he did so by inserting a clause which maintained deep French influence in Africa. And almost all post-colonial African states at the time who were former French colonies accepted this. And you did have some tensions between de Gaulle and the United States. So he did literally withdraw from the NATO structure because he said, okay, we're not part of NATO, France is not part of NATO anymore, but we know that NATO is gonna protect us anyhow if the Soviets invade. He didn't wanna rely on the American nuclear deterrent, so he worked in the 60s for France to acquire their own nuclear weapons. Also, when you had the creation of the precocious European Union, de Gaulle vetoed the UK's entry into that because he thought that the UK had too close a relationship with the United States. France sometimes supported what the United States did. For example, de Gaulle very strongly backed what Kennedy did during the Cuban Missile Crisis and said that France stands with you. And he actually resigned from office at a high point. He could have stayed on longer. So when you had the 1968 student protests, he worked to escalate that, and then a year later he resigned, even though he could have stayed in office because he was done with politics. And then Kissinger talks about Richard Nixon, and this is of course the longest chapter in the book since Kissinger had a close political relationship with Nixon when he was president, as Kissinger was first National Security Advisor and then Secretary of State under Richard Nixon. And Nixon served as the president from 1969 to 1974, and his strategy was equilibrium. So Kissinger basically in this chapter justifies everything that America did in Vietnam. And he says that they were working towards preserving southern Vietnamese sovereignty, and that in the peace process you always had the North Vietnamese trying to undermine it by constantly encroaching into South Vietnam's sovereignty. But Nixon used military force to gain power in the peace process. But then Kissinger argues that despite the peace treaty that was eventually reached, I think in 1973, the problem was that Congress cut off funding to the Vietnam or to Vietnam. So South Vietnam lost all American support, and according to Kissinger, that's why South Vietnam fell. It's an interesting thesis. I'm not sure how accurate it is, but it is still a very interesting counterpoint to the typical narrative of Vietnam bad, American empire. And Kissinger emphasizes the importance of low-key diplomacy, you could say, as through doing that, instead of being very vocal and hating the Soviet Union, the United States actually got a concession from the Soviet Union, allowing a lot of Soviet Jews to migrate. And afterwards, when you had more vocal proponents of Jewish emigration from the Soviet Union, the number of Jews who emigrated actually fell because the Soviet Union felt cornered in that situation. In 1970, you actually had Syria invading Jordan, but America applied very strong pressure on Syria to stop, so Syria stopped, preserving Jordan's sovereignty. And what really epitomizes his strategy of equilibrium was shifting China from the Soviet Union to the United States fully, by having Kissinger visit China and then visiting China himself. But the thing is, they had to do this through back channels. They had no direct diplomatic contact with China, and during the Cultural Revolution, China was very closed off from the world. There was barely any ambassadors anywhere. It's a bit like North Korea in a sense, maybe even more extreme. But Kissinger, when trying to negotiate with China, he had to go through Pakistan, which had a good relationship with China. And that, according to Kissinger, is why the United States couldn't really do much when Pakistan was slaughtering Bangladeshis in Bangladesh during the early 70s. Because through Pakistan, because Kissinger flew through Pakistan and then went to China, he was able to create an opening to China. So eventually, China became de facto an American ally during the Cold War, despite Mao. And this led, of course, to the close relationship that China has with the United States even today, but in an economic sense. Kissinger, at the very end of the chapter, says something very dumb, basically that, oh, we haven't had a statesman like Nixon that's good since he left office. We have an American crisis with a bunch of bad statesmen. Oh, Nixon is gone, which, no. Nixon was a pretty good president on foreign policy for his time, but the end of the Cold War required a different strategy, so that's why you needed people like Carter and Reagan to come in and replace Nixon and actually be a lot more ideological. Kissinger seems to fail to understand that the importance of American presence in the world is related to ideological reasons, not just power, and you need the ideology to justify the power in a certain sense. And Nixon didn't do that much, and that was understandable in the 1960s and 70s, but in the 80s, when you just needed to push a bit more for the Soviet Union to collapse, the ideological part was very justified. Then Henry Kissinger moves on to Anwar Sadat, who was president of, or dictator of Egypt from 1970 to 1981. So he succeeded Nasser, and Anwar Sadat was very different from Nasser. I actually wrote an essay for my international relations course, a profile of the leader Anwar Sadat. And here you have the strategy of transcendence. And by the way, when I wrote this essay, I used the lens of constructivism. And my argument basically in that essay was that Sadat was very different from Nasser ideologically. Nasser is someone who believes in pan-Arabism and is very anti-Israeli and very anti-Western, also quite socialistic. Anwar Sadat was far more liberal. His view of Islam, although he was a devout Muslim, was that it could coexist with Christianity and Judaism, and that you can have peace in the Middle East in the long run, and that you should emphasize the Egyptian identity instead of the pan-Arabic identity. So when Anwar Sadat came to power, you had the corrective revolution, and Egypt began to shift away from the Soviet Union and towards the West. So the Soviet military advisors were kicked out. Anwar Sadat and his national security advisor began to negotiate with Nixon and Kissinger. And then it's interesting because the 1973 October War, when Syria and Egypt attacked Israel, from Egypt's perspective, it was very different from the Egyptian wars against Israel that occurred with Nasser, because Nasser did it for pan-Arabic reasons, while Sadat did it to reassert Egyptian sovereignty, because after the 1967 war, Israel was occupying the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt. Egypt recaptured some of that in the 1973 war, but it shifted the things in diplomacy where Israel and Egypt could begin to negotiate. Kissinger mediated a lot of this. Of course, once Kissinger was out of office, you had Jimmy Carter mediating this through the Camp David Accords. But Sadat was also very bold in his own way. For example, he visited Jerusalem. Eventually, he had a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. So Egypt recognized Israel. Israel withdrew from the Sinai Peninsula. But a bunch of Arab states retaliated against Egypt. A bunch of Arab countries got diplomatic ties with Egypt, but this formed the basis of wider Arab-Israeli peace in the long term, although it's very far from accomplished. So Sadat started a process towards Middle Eastern peace, however flawed and incomplete it is. And Sadat also did some liberal reforms at home, so there was a little more freedom of expression under him than Nasser. Religious tolerance was way more. You had the strengthening of the universities, you had some liberal economic reforms, but Sadat still needed to use some repression, because once you had the Israeli peace treaty thing, Then you had a lot of tensions in Egypt, which eventually culminated in Sadat being assassinated for his cause. And since then, you haven't had a leader as accomplished as Sadat in Egypt. Mubarak just tried to maintain the status quo. The Arab Spring destabilized things a bit in Egypt for a couple of years, and then you had a worse, more socialistic, authoritarian dictator come to power with Sisi. And then the next chapter is about Lee Kuan Yew, who served as the prime minister or quasi-dictator of Singapore from 1959 to 1990, initially as a British colony, then as part of Malaysia, and then as an independent state. And here Kissinger terms this the strategy of excellence. So initially Lee Kuan Yew kind of had a Malay identity, so he wanted a union with Malaysia, but that only lasted 2-3 years in the 60s until Malaysia basically kicked Singapore out of the country and Singapore was forced to declare independence in 1965. And Lee Kuan Yew was afraid for Singapore's independence because that is a very tiny country between Indonesia and Malaysia. And I think you had Sukarno in Indonesia who was thinking of invading Singapore. So Lee Kuan Yew did some things to save Singapore. So first of all, he introduced conscription, and then he also instituted a meritocratic, very economically liberal state. So Singapore is the most pro-business, most free market country in the world currently. And he was also very strongly in favor of an American presence in Southeast Asia. And of course, Singapore became very rich under him. But interestingly, something I learned in this book is that Lee Kuan Yew was actually the inspiration of a lot of Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms in China, where China moved a bit more towards capitalism, because you had Deng Xiaoping visiting Singapore, and at the time Singapore didn't recognize China yet, I think. Lee Kuan Yew basically showed, look at all the wealth we have there in Singapore, and Deng Xiaoping was like, oh, I want that in China. So that's part of the inspiration of the economic reforms in China is Singapore, although he didn't go as far as Singapore, of course. Lee Kuan Yew eventually stepped away from power in 1990. Singapore is basically the best functioning dictatorship in the world, so you have a limited amount of free speech. You have basically among the best bureaucracy in the world there. Very efficient state, although a bit authoritarian. So Singapore stayed a dictatorship after him, but you've had a couple of other leaders since him, and you're gonna have a third around the time that this video is released. But even after he retired, Lee Kuan Yew remained sharp. Kissinger talks about how he had a lot of conversations regularly with Lee Kuan Yew for around 20 years after that. And Lee Kuan Yew also tried to accommodate the rise of China and make sure that China and the United States could coexist in a peaceful world. Of course, Lee Kuan Yew also had some of his Confucian values, so he had his own problems with American culture, but he believed in a more peaceful world order that was possible, even with China and the United States coexisting, although that is not guaranteed. Now, I would say that the one mistake that Lee Kuan Yew made, although Kissinger doesn't say this, is that I could understand the need for perhaps the dictatorship under Lee Kuan Yew or the fake democracy that they have while he was in power, but he had made Singapore so meritocratic and stable that I would argue that the ethnic tensions wouldn't be a problem that much anymore, you know, with the ethnic groups in Singapore of the Chinese majority and then the Malay and Indian minorities. So I think that Lee Kuan Yew, after he retired, Singapore could have turned into a democracy, but it's not, it's still a dictatorship. And even though it's the best dictatorship in the world, it's still a far less nice place to live than freer democracies you have around the world, such as Taiwan or such as Western countries where you actually have freedom of expression. That's mostly respected. Then the final chapter in this book is about Margaret Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister of the UK from 1979 to 1990. And here Kissinger talks about the strategy of conviction. Kissinger basically argues that Thatcher pushed the envelope as much as possible towards capitalistic economic reforms. So she didn't go all the way, but Kissinger argues that with the paradigm you had at the time in the UK, it wasn't possible to go any further. She shifted the paradigm as much as possible. She did privatize a lot of stuff, and that did also make the remaining bureaucracy more efficient. And although she couldn't really cut spending, she did severely cut the influence of the state in UK society, which is a good thing, I would say. Thatcher also worked hard on maintaining a special relationship with the United States, and you could say it reached its peak under her and Reagan's rule. So the special relationship between the US and UK, I used to think that it's only that, oh, the UK just does whatever the US wants, and for that gets special economic treatment or whatever. But no, it's not only that. It's also that through this special relationship, the UK actually gets a lot of influence in US foreign policy. And this you could see under Thatcher. So during the Cold War stuff between Reagan and Gorbachev, Thatcher had actually a lot of influence in this and did get some changes to some arms limitation treaties from the UK national interest perspective that helped her. But she also believed strongly in Westphalian sovereignty. So after Argentina invaded the Falklands in 1982, she retook that despite everyone believing that, oh, that's not possible. But she succeeded despite that. She also negotiated for the peaceful return of Hong Kong to China. But there are some people in retrospect who have thought that that's a mistake. But the thing is, China could have conquered Hong Kong militarily, and that would have just destabilized things and made things worse for Hong Kongers. So the peaceful transition you had, where the whole of Hong Kong was handed back to China in 1997, that actually did permit for autonomy in Hong Kong for 22 years and a liberal system of government, even though it should have been 50 years as promised by the Chinese. So the Chinese broke the world, but at least through Margaret Thatcher's negotiations, Hong Kong was able to remain free until 2019 or so. Something I didn't know before is that Bush Sr. was lukewarm on liberating Kuwait after Iraq had invaded it. Thatcher strongly pushed Bush toward liberating Kuwait and kicking Iraq out, so Bush eventually did so in 1991. Thatcher, because she grew up during World War II, still was very skeptical of Germany, so she opposed German unification, which that didn't work. Germany reunified despite what she wished. The downfall of Thatcher is how much she opposed EU integration. So you had the Conservative Party eventually turn on her and replace her with someone who was more pro-EU in 1990. Although Thatcher remained respected among a lot of people in the UK, and even Tony Blair, the Labour leader who came after her, respected her and did maintain some of her free market policies despite being a Labour politician. So Thatcher did have a pretty good enduring legacy on Britain and also on other parts of the world. And then Kissinger moves to his conclusion. Kissinger's conclusion is basically a call to action for the reinvigoration of the humanities, such as literature, the classics, history, and also deep literacy, where you read books or difficult texts and think about them and gain inspiration, including fiction, instead of just doing a bunch of stuff on social media where you don't think, or you post and you don't think what you're doing. And he believes that doing all of this is even important in an age where you have AI. He believes that it's a problem that universities have turned into activist hotbeds instead of statesmen's cradles, and that there's too much focus on the technical stuff. And what I appreciate with this book is that Kissinger is able to show how 6 world leaders, through sheer free will and conviction and intelligence and pragmatism and other stuff, were able to influence the world for the better. So Konrad Adenauer built Germany into a stable liberal democracy that has contributed to a prosperous Europe. Charles de Gaulle regained French sovereignty, and he also killed off some of the unstabling dynamics in France, and he also handled decolonization pretty well. Richard Nixon successfully brought the Cold War in America's favor by shifting China to us, and he did a lot of other important foreign policy stuff that was good for the world, although I haven't mentioned it. Nixon did a ton of stuff with arms negotiations or the Middle East, or a lot of other stuff which I'm not mentioning here. Or you had Sadat that was able to make Egypt a better country, a freer, more wealthy country, and finally stopped all the interstate wars with Israel. And then of course you have Kuan Yew, who created the perfect example of what an enlightened despot is and turned Singapore into an extremely wealthy country, but also contributed to stabilizing world order. And then you had Margaret Thatcher, who moved Britain more towards capitalism, but also gained influence with the United States that changed some things in the Cold War for the better and partially led to the downfall of the Soviet Union and the satellite states in Eastern Europe. So yeah, how would I rate this book? I would give it an 8 out of 10. I prefer it to World Order. I appreciate these in-depth case studies on each world leader. Of course, Kissinger says some things that I don't agree with, but far less in this book than in World Order. It's amazing how well written this book is, even though he wrote this at 99, and the year after he wrote this, in 2023, last year, I think around December, Kissinger died. So this is his last book. This is the last big piece of writing he leaves as his legacy to us. And you have a lot of interesting reflections in this book, and this is also a pretty good primary source if you want to learn about some world leaders, as Kissinger knew personally these people. Some of these people were even kind of his friends. So yeah, would I recommend Leadership if you want to learn about any of these people, or if you just want to learn about the influence of leadership in global politics, especially in the Cold War, then you should definitely read this book. And you can also read this book in whatever order. So read the introduction first, but then read which chapter you ever want first, the one that sounds most interesting to you. That's what I did. It might make more sense to read it chronologically, but I think it's fine to read this book however you want. Just end with the conclusion and start with the introduction. And if you want to know more about Henry Kissinger's writing, then you should check out this book review of his book World Order, which just talks about the visions of world orders from different countries such as Iran, the United States, India, China, Europe. Otherwise, I'm the Avid Reader, and I will see you readers next time.